Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the final second Thursday video recording for the 2022 to 23 school year. I'm Mary Thyssen-Milder, and I'm the Physical Education Consultant at the Minnesota Department of Education. This presentation is a product of the Professional Development Plan designed by the Minnesota Department of Education's Physical Education Leadership Team, made up of state leaders in physical education from the Minnesota Society of Health and Physical Educators, or MnSHAPE, representatives of the Minnesota Developmental Adaptive Physical Education, or MnDAPE, the co-chairs of the Physical Education Standards Committee, and higher education. Things to keep in mind. The intent of this video is to summarize 17 standards implementation videos created to help guide schools and teachers through the process. So hold on to your hats. The standard implementation process is fluid, so this presentation will not follow the videos in a linear way. For simplicity's sake, the content will be organized around Shape America's essential components of physical education and opportunity to learn guidelines, with the disclaimer that we know that the implementation process is extremely complex. This is just a way to organize things. This slide identifies the key topics in the 3-year standard implementation plan designed by the MDE PE leadership team. This slide identifies the 17 videos that were created to highlight key concepts in the physical education standard implementation process. The videos serve as starting points for teachers to review and initiate a conversation with colleagues within schools and districts as local decisions are made regarding aligning assessment, curriculum, and instruction to the knowledge and skills outlined in the standards. Links to all videos are found on the MDE Physical Education and MnSHAPE websites. And speaking of the MDE and MnSHAPE websites, here are some screenshots of the MDE Physical Education Standards implementation page and the MnSHAPE MDE handout page. When these websites were visited, multiple standards resources can be found to assist teachers in the implementation process. This graphic is an example of a standard implementation process. The actual steps that you or your district go through may look similar or slightly different, but this diagram gives us a sense of everything that should be happening in standards-based curriculum and instruction development. As stated earlier, the standard implementation process is fluid and often cycles in the process of continuous improvement. There are initial programming decisions to be reviewed, defining your program's mission, vision, and values. What are the considerations for your learners? Who are they? What are their needs? What program factors can and can't you control, like space, equipment, time, and schedule? Take deep dives into the meanings of your standards and benchmarks, deconstruct them, bundle them, write performance outcomes, and determine assessments, align performance outcomes to unit planning and lesson plans, and determine instructional strategies. During the standard review and implementation processes, Minnesota has clear delineations for responsibilities between the state and local school districts. It's the responsibility of the state to facilitate the development of the standards and grade level benchmarks and design an implementation plan to assist districts in their adoption process. As Minnesota is a local control state, the Minnesota Department of Education does not decide on curriculum. Rather, it's up to local school districts to decide what materials to use to meet the required standards and benchmarks. Physical educators align assessment, curriculum, and instruction to the knowledge and skills outlined in the standards through achievable benchmarks that provide a pathway from kindergarten through high school. To begin our standard implementation journey, let's examine what the leading experts in physical education have identified as the core foundational components needed for a successful physical education program. Shape America identifies these core foundational components as essential components of physical education that provide structure for a physical education program. Shape America created this guidance document that provides an explanation of these essential components. We will be using this document to organize the structure of this video and insert implementation concepts as they are discussed. In addition to the essential components of physical education, Shape America's Opportunity to Learn guidelines identify essential program elements and environmental conditions that provide learning foundations for students in elementary, middle, and high school. Exploring the opportunity to learn elements is a vital part of the beginning of a standard implementation process. These programmatic elements support high-quality physical education and are prerequisites for teaching and learning in physical education. Taking the time to assess what the current conditions are to provide a better understanding of what is required for student success. It's highly recommended schools utilize this document in the initial phases of standard implementation to assess if current conditions align with SHAPE's recommendations for health and safety, class size, facilities, materials and equipment, time allocation for class, use of technology, assessment, curriculum, program evaluation, and teacher qualifications. These are the 4 essential components for a physical education program identified by Shape America: policy and environment, curriculum, appropriate instruction, and assessment. Let's begin with policy. A major policy recommendation from Shape America is that the state has its own standards for physical education. Minnesota has utilized the SHAPE standards since 2012. Our latest standards are the 2018 Academic Standards in Physical Education that were adapted from Shape America's National Physical Education Standards and Grade Level Outcomes. By the 2023 to 24 school year, instruction in physical education in grades K to 8 must include all the 2018 Minnesota K-12 Academic Standards in Physical Education. Courses at the high school level through which students meet physical education graduation requirements must include the 2018 Minnesota Academic Standards in Physical Education. Another important state-level policy recommendation is required physical education for all students. In Minnesota, all students in grades K to 8 must receive instruction in physical education every year. Time is determined at the local level. High school students must receive instruction in physical education at least once. The amount of credit and graduation requirements are determined at the local level. Time allocated for physical education must be enough for students to meet the required grade level benchmarks. Teacher licensure requirements for physical education is critical at the state level. In Minnesota, elementary, middle, and high school physical education is required to be taught by a certified, licensed teacher who is endorsed to teach physical education. Minnesota state law does allow elementary teachers to teach physical education to their own grade levels. Physical education teachers are required to receive professional development specific to physical education. Minnesota requires 125 CEU hours that is renewable over a 5-year period. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, is a law that ensures children with disabilities have access to free public education with special services designated to design their unique needs in an inclusive environment. Developmental Adaptive Physical Education, or DAPE as it's also called, means specifically designed physical education instruction and services for pupils with disabilities who have a substantial delay or disorder in physical development. Developmental adaptive physical education provides special education instruction for pupils ages 3 to 21. Adaptive physical education adapts, modifies, and or changes a physical activity so it is as appropriate for the person with a disability as it is for a person without a disability. Minnesota has a very strong DAPE licensure requirement. Find all information regarding Minnesota DAPE on the MinDAPE website. Another Shape America policy recommendation is that the state does not permit school districts or schools to allow students to substitute other activities for their required physical education credit, and that the state does not grant exemptions or waivers for school districts regarding physical education time or credit requirements. The state of Minnesota does not support these practices. It's another policy recommendation from SHAPE to establish a positive learning environment where physical activity is not assigned or withheld as punishment. Minnesota has legislation to discourage schools from using physical activity as punishment. This checklist is part of Shape America's essential component of physical education document. It provides a great guideline as you review policy. Now let's move on to talking about the standard implementation process aligned with curriculum. The physical education curriculum is the written, clearly articulated plan for how standards and educational outcomes will be attained through a school district. A well-designed, standards-based physical education curriculum has many parts and provides the framework for the identified milestones aligned with the learning activities in the curriculum and protocols for how learning is measured. The physical education curriculum serves the purpose of standardizing the curriculum in a school district across schools and ensuring equitable education for all. The physical education curriculum sets clear goals and objectives that align with state standards and identifies the core skills and content to be taught at all grade levels from K to 12, called curriculum mapping. The curriculum describes learning experiences and instructional resources through a scope and sequence, identifies student assessments or evidence of student learning, and includes instructional strategies for differentiation of instruction and modifies for students with disabilities. Essentially, a curriculum outlines what a student should know and be able to do and guides a teacher how to reach those goals. The 5 Minnesota physical education standards establish the overall goals for student learning and are repeated from kindergarten through grade 12. The emphasis of the standards differ at the elementary to middle school to high school levels. At the elementary level, grades K to 5, benchmarks relate to the development of fundamental skills. These form the building blocks for gameplay, physical activity, and fitness in middle school and high school. Critical elements are emphasized in motor skills, which identify key components that can be observed in movement efficiency. Middle school is the transition level from isolated skills and knowledge learned in elementary school to the application of them. The focus is on categories of games such as invasion, net and wall, target, fielding, and striking. Competition in each area is de-emphasized and gaining personal competence is stressed. This leads to more of an emphasis on practice tasks and small-sided games. High school is the lifelong utilization stage. Benchmarks at the high school level reflect the minimum knowledge and skills students must have to be college or career ready at graduation. There's less emphasis on team sports, with more of an emphasis on the application of individual skill and knowledge and an emphasis on personal choice, lifetime activities, fitness activities, and dance. Minnesota benchmarks are organized by what we call focus areas. This slide identifies the focus areas in each of the grade bands. You'll note most of the focus areas are the same across all grade bands, except the fundamental movement skills at the elementary level that move into the application and game categories in the middle school and high school levels. The benchmarks are designed so they increase in rigor from grade level to grade level. This slide portrays the K-5 learning progressions. Keep in mind that these progressions represent rigor expectations we expect students to know and be able to do as they advance from grade level to grade level. They can be visible in verbs or in concepts that increase in rigor. This slide portrays how learning progressions advance from the elementary to the middle school levels. In 5th grade, students strike with a short-handled instrument in a small-sided game. In 6th grade, this skill transfers to a forehand volley with control using a short-handled implement in a small-sided net and wall game practice task. The best way for physical educators working together to reach common agreement about the meaning of a benchmark is through deconstruction. Deconstruction is a process of identifying the defining parts of the statement that will help teachers understand the key components of the benchmark. It's important to understand both the different parts and the entire statement of learning. There's more than one way to deconstruct a benchmark. Here are 2 options for deconstructing a benchmark. In physical education, we usually use option 1, identify the content, the criteria, and the condition. This slide portrays an example of the deconstruction process. In a 4th grade benchmark, a student will throw overhand with accuracy to a moving target. The content is to throw overhand. The criteria is with accuracy, and the condition is to a moving target. A common question we get from teachers is, how in the world am I going to be able to meet all these benchmarks? Bundling is a process we've introduced to help teachers manage the number of benchmarks in a grade level. This occurs after there is a solid foundation for understanding the standards, academic language, and learning progressions within them, and how to deconstruct them. Bundling helps students see the connections between concepts, brings coherence to instruction, and can allow more efficient use of instructional time. Within and across content areas, the curriculum can be arranged in bundles so that units of instruction can be built using approaches such as themes, authentic processes, problem-based learning, essential questions, or big ideas. Done well, integrated or bundled instruction and curriculum supports students in developing knowledge and skills in more than one standard at the same time. This is one idea of how to describe the process of bundling from the MDE Physical Education Leadership Team. The analogy for bundling is similar to making a salad. Think about benchmarks as individual ingredients in a salad, and that salads are a bundle. The number of ingredients in any salad can vary from a few to many. It is the same for bundles of benchmarks. It is not feasible, nor is it best practice, to teach to one benchmark at a time. Therefore, we combine or bundle benchmarks to create cohesive chunks of content that will be taught in integrated or connected way. This is an example of a very simple 3rd grade physical education bundle. We ask teachers to start with benchmark in standard 1, then find one complementary or cohesive benchmark across the remaining 4 standards. This slide shows the final product or bundle. From standard 1, students perform a variety of jumps. Add a benchmark from standard 2 while applying speed and force. Add another from standard 3 and be able to define the impact of jumping on hearts and lungs. Add another from standard 4 by working by themselves responsibly and safely. And finally, add another from standard 5 and identify what they find hard to do and what they like best. So this bundle would read that students perform a variety of jumps by working by themselves responsibly and safely, applying speed and force. Students will be able to define the impact that jumping has on their heart and lungs and identify what they find hard to do and what they like best. Remember, this is just one way that benchmarks can be bundled. This is an example for the jump rope bundle mentioned earlier, color-coded by standard with jump roping identified as the activity. For specific information of how to bundle, watch the bundling video. The next step after bundling is to write a performance outcome for the bundle. Performance outcomes describe what students will be able to do after learning the content, the benchmarks within the bundle. A performance outcome shares the key characteristic of accurately measuring one or more core standards. A key feature is that a performance outcome requires students to produce an end result. This could be a report, a performance, or an experiment. This is then scored against a set of criteria. A performance outcome measures a student's ability to apply the skills and knowledge learned from a unit or units of study. The overall idea is that it closely mirrors real-life scenarios. This slide shows an example performance outcome for the jump rope bundle displayed earlier in this presentation. The bolded portions draw attention to the content of the benchmarks, but which is also important is that the performance outcome is written so that it's easy to understand how a student would meet this outcome. Students will use correct force and speed to perform 5 different jump rope tricks chosen from a set of 10 options. They will use these experiences to create their own definition of cardiorespiratory fitness and recognize the effects of consecutive jumping has on the heart and lungs. They will demonstrate responsible behaviors by remaining on task and following the safety protocols, and they will reflect on their personal experiences with challenge and enjoyment. Part of the standard implementation process in curriculum is utilizing the backward planning framework that guides educators to intentionally create lessons around specific goals or outcomes. It provides a structure that helps determine what instructional activities and assessments to include, and it does so while ensuring everything taught aligns with the standards and grade level benchmarks. This graphic is a simple outline of backward planning when creating units of instruction. First, select the standards you want to cover. These are the goals and describe what success looks like. Next, list the grade level benchmarks that align with the desired standards or benchmark. These are the objectives to reach the goals. Design the final assessment or project that determines how students will demonstrate they have achieved the desired outcomes. Create lessons that serve as a practice leading up to assessment. Reflect and ask yourself what worked, what didn't work, and what could be done differently. Curriculum mapping is part of the standard implementation process. To begin the planning process, take a calendar and map out the learning outcomes wanted to teach at each grade level, considering vertical articulation, learning progressions, and bundling where appropriate. It's an intense process, but so worth it for teachers and for students. Universal design is also a part of standard implementation and review processes. It is an inclusion strategy often incorporated by physical educators with 3 guidelines for learning: provide multiple means of engagement, provide multiple means of representation, and provide multiple means of action and expression. In physical education settings, universal design for learning principles prompt educators to carefully consider the attributes and capabilities of students and modify activities for maximal participation and success. Adaptations can be made to equipment sizes, rules of the game, and instructional practices. This checklist is part of the Shape America's essential component of physical education document. It provides a great guideline as you review and revise the curriculum and can assist in the standard revision process. The next thing is to ask the question, how do we know if students have achieved the benchmark in the performance outcome? This is where assessment comes in. The purpose of assessment is to provide evidence of student learning and student achievement towards outcomes and standards. Teachers can use them to plan for future instruction, provide feedback to students, formalize the observation process, and document program effectiveness. There are many types and categories of assessments. At the curriculum level, student assessment should align with the state physical education standards and grade level benchmarks. They should be included in the written physical education curriculum, along with administrative protocols, and include evidence-based best practices that measure student achievement in all areas of instruction. Students should be graded in a way that relate directly to student learning objectives identified in the written physical education curriculum. And all teachers should follow protocols for reporting and communicating student progress to students and parents and caregivers. Assessments in physical education units and lesson include conducting formative pre-assessments to learn where students are at the beginning of a learning sequence, ongoing formative assessments during instruction to check for understanding, summative assessments at the close of a unit or instructional sequence to provide a comprehensive summary of student progress. It's important to identify the difference between formative and summative assessment. Formative assessment informs teaching. They tell us where a student is at the beginning of a unit. Throughout a unit of study, formative assessment measures whether or not students are on track to achieve the intended outcomes and help identify areas of difficulty. Summative assessments are designed to measure student outcomes and are used to determine a final grade. Summative assessment sums up what each student knows and can do after instruction, practice, and feedback have taken place. Formative assessment is ungraded, flexible, and creative. The results of formative assessment should be used in two ways. Students receive feedback based on the assessment. This feedback should allow students to improve their performance in preparation for the summative assessment. It's not just important enough to determine whether a student is making progress towards proficiency, but teachers should use the information to shape their teaching. Formative assessment results in form if students are ready to continue instruction, or if review is as needed, or if reteaching the skill or content is necessary before moving on. If students are on target or progressing rapidly, consider ways to deepen the learning or extend it to other contexts. If students are falling short or making critical errors, use that information to determine where to focus efforts and which concepts to reinforce. Here are some examples of formative assessments: pre-assessments, observations, rubrics, checklist, rating scales, physical activity logs, portfolios, and projects. Formative assessments don't need to be complex. They can be as simple as observing students while they complete a task. The key is to use the information gathered to determine where to go next. By contrast, summative assessment is graded and provides an opportunity for students to demonstrate whether they have achieved the intended outcomes. Summative assessments show what students know and are able to do. Summative assessments are conclusions based upon statistical analysis of data, such as percentiles, standard scores, or other statistical comparisons, and are used to assess overall achievement. The line between formative and summative is not always crystal clear. For example, portfolios can be used for either summative or formative assessments. The thing to consider is the weight of the assessment. Is the purpose of the assessment to provide feedback on students' ability or knowledge? It's formative. Does the assessment measure how much content a student has learned or can perform? Then it's summative. Now let's take the performance outcome identified earlier and apply potential ways to assess it. This is the critical part of the implementation process. First, are there benchmarks in the performance outcome that can be grouped or assessed together? In this case, yes. combined students will perform a variety of jump rope skills with the benchmark that students will apply effort awareness concepts of speed and force. Next, we determine what part of the performance outcome is being assessed. For this, we identify students will use correct force and speed to perform 5 different jump rope tricks chosen from a set of 10 options. Finally, we identify the assessment tool. We will use a student jump rope performance rubric. Here's a picture of what the potential jump rope rubric might look like. We are using a 3-point rubric for both benchmarks and inserting the jump rope skills identified. It is critically important the scoring criteria in the rubric be clearly defined right up front and shared with the student. They need to know what developing, competent, and proficient look like. Going back to the performance assessment, determine the next benchmark for assessment. This time, we choose the benchmark that asks students to define cardiorespiratory fitness and provide examples of physical activities that enhance cardiorespiratory fitness. The part of the performance outcome being assessed is that students will use these experiences to create their own definition of cardiorespiratory fitness and recognize the effect that consecutive jumping has on the heart and lungs, and will reflect on their personal experiences with challenge and enjoyment. The assessment tool will be a student worksheet. Here's what the student worksheet could look like. Again, it is important that the teacher identify the criteria for a 1, 2, or 3. This can be done during class or outside of class. Going back to the performance outcome, what are the remaining benchmarks and how can they be assessed? Can they be combined into one assessment tool? For this situation, yes. We will combine the benchmark that students will work independently and exhibit responsibility with the benchmark that students will move safely using equipment in general space with minimal reminders. The part of the performance outcome that's being assessed is that students will demonstrate respectful behaviors by remaining on task and follow the safety protocols. The assessment tool is a teacher observation checklist. Here's a sample teacher observation checklist. The scoring guide identifies that students should have multiple opportunities to exhibit each of the 3 behaviors. When a teacher observes the behavior, a student receives an X. This slide summarizes all the assessment tools utilized in the unit for each student. It can be shared with students accompanied by the details of their scores for each assessment. A critical question for teachers and students is how can a performance outcome be graded? First, it's important to identify how grades are utilized. The primary purpose of a grade is to report the achievement of a student to external audiences. Performances during the school year represented by grades is also utilized to determine whether the secondary students can earn credit towards graduation requirements. Employers use grades to indicate the competence of potential employees. Grades can be used to sort students into more advanced classes. Colleges use GPAs as a predictor of student success in higher education. The practice of grading can be driven by school policy and expectations. Now let's address grading the unit. Grading should be an exercise in professional judgment, not the widespread practice of simply averaging a set of scores. Physical educators should analyze the body of evidence and determine, not just calculate grades. Avoid using the mean. Consider using the median or mode. Extreme scores, particularly a 0, have a profound effect on averaging. The mean may not provide an accurate description of what a student really knows and can do. Teachers should also consider weighting components carefully to achieve the intent of the final grade. The way in which achievement results are combined generally involves weighting the different learning targets in order to reflect this intent. Here's a summary of guidelines for standards-based grading. Relate grading procedures to standards. Use criteria and reference performance standards to determine grades. Limit factors included in grades to achievement. Sample student performance. Do not use all scores in grades. Keep records so they can be changed or updated regularly. Crunch numbers carefully. Avoid using the mean. Consider using the median or mode. Use quality assessments and properly record evidence of achievement. Discuss and involve students in grading. For more information on grading, please review the grading video in the Professional Development series. It's important teachers follow school district or school protocols for reporting and communicating student progress to students, parents, or guardians. Here is a sample elementary standards-based progress report from Shape America. A quick comment on fitness testing. Fitness testing is a valuable part of fitness education when integrated appropriately into a comprehensive physical education curriculum. However, students' fitness scores should not be used to grade students or evaluate physical education teachers. See Shape America's position statement on appropriate and inappropriate practices related to fitness testing. When reviewing assessment practices, complete the student assessment section on the physical education checklist. This video has provided an overview of summative and formative assessment. For more detailed videos around assessment in physical education, additional videos have been created. They are entitled Best Practices in Physical Education Assessment, Beyond Bundling, Writing Performance Outcomes in Physical Education, Best Practices in Physical Education Grading, and Applying Physical Education Standards-Based Assessments and Grading Practices. They are available on the MDE and MnShape websites. The final component to discuss as part of the standard implementation and review processes is examining instructional practices. The expected standard for student-centered physical education instruction involves a wide variety of approaches that allow teachers to organize and deliver the content to students in the most effective way possible. Strategies that support appropriate instruction include addressing diverse developmental levels through differentiated instruction, employing a wide variety of instructional strategies, aligning learning activities with identified student objectives and outcomes for learning, and providing students with the opportunity to demonstrate content and skill mastery. Differentiated instruction involves providing choice and voice to students so that we meet their needs and help all students achieve the desired learning objectives. Teachers are trained to know that students have different learning styles, experiences, and interests. The root word for differentiation is different. Differentiation asks us to tailor instruction to learners' diverse needs. There are 4 ways to differentiate instruction: content, process, product, and learning environment. The first element for differentiate is to differentiate by content. In a physical education class, there's a wide variety of ability. A teacher should differentiate what is to be learned, build on the strengths of individual students while helping students identify ways they can improve their movement and physical fitness, provide multiple opportunities to demonstrate what they've learned. A good format is learn, practice, demonstrate, and more practice. To differentiate by process, employ a wide variety of instructional strategies, effective questioning, and flexible groupings to make learning accessible to all students. When creating instruction, allow for gradual skill building. This involves 2 strategies, tiering and grouping. Tiering involves modifying ways for students to learn, practice, and demonstrate movement skills or fitness skills according to their own readiness level, ability, and interests. Grouping is a tactic where students are grouped together in a variety of ways in order to deliver instruction, such as small group or partners. Other ways to differentiate by process vary by activity, but could include varying the size of the ball, varying the distance from the target, modifying rules to allow for more success or more practice of a skill, using visual signs or graphics, conducting frequent check-ins, breaking instruction into smaller, easier to understand skills. To differentiate by product allows students to decide how they will demonstrate competency. Station-centered activities provide choice and support gradual skill building. In a station or circuit format, allow students to self-regulate and self-monitor by letting them choose their different challenge. Differentiating by process and product builds confidence and increases motivation and movement competence. The fourth element of differentiation is the learning environment. A physically and emotionally safe learning environment increases learning for all students and fosters respect, consistency, and fairness. Get to know students' interests, previous experiences, and goals related to physical literacy. Work together to determine what success looks like. Create cooperative learning experiences instead of competitive learning experiences. Create a culturally responsive setting. Thoughtfully build relatable cultural references into lessons. Understand your own as well as your students' cultural identity. Now let's examine employing a wide variety of instructional strategies. To assist with employing a wide variety of instructional strategies, Shape America has created a document entitled Appropriate Instructional Practice Guidelines, K-12, a side-by-side comparison. This document outlines developmentally appropriate and inappropriate practices in elementary, middle, and high school physical education classes and is organized into 5 separate sections: the learning environment, instructional strategies, curriculum, assessment, and professionalism. The guidelines are organized into a grid, which includes a side-by-side comparison of appropriate and inappropriate practices at all levels. These side-by-side comparisons are then organized into sections of areas of concern for physical education. Strategies that support appropriate instruction also include aligning learning activities with identified student objectives and outcomes for learning. The state standards and benchmarks serve as the greater goals and objectives that make up units. The lesson plans created then serve as scaffolding towards meeting the standards and developing the skills outlined in the unit plan. The final strategy is to support appropriate instruction is providing students with the opportunity to demonstrate content and skill mastery. The key is that there is lots and lots of practice opportunities. Utilize the Shape America checklist to take inventory of the school physical education program and appropriate instruction. To complete the standard implementation process, we'll use the next several slides to identify credible and free resources that assist teachers in creating physical education units and lesson plans. The first resource is OPEN, the Physical Education Online Network. The OPEN website is rich with resources for teachers working on curriculum. The Tools for Teaching section provides a multitude of sample units and lesson plans aligned to the national standards. This is an example of a module overview for grade 3 to 5 in Invasion Basics. You can see it identifies the national standards and national outcomes aligned to the module. As a footnote, as a Minnesota teacher, you'll need to utilize the Minnesota benchmarks aligned to the standards. You can utilize the Minnesota benchmark and national outcomes alignment documents found on the MDE and MinShape websites. The module then provides information for planning complete lessons and potential assessments. Another very credible and free resource is Dynamic PE ASAP. It provides resources for developing units at all levels. This is an example of secondary units available. Finally, Shape America also has a multitude of free and accessible resources for the curriculum development process. Their Teacher's Toolbox is a primary example. I don't know about you, but I'm exhausted just walking through this implementation process. As I said at the beginning and portrayed on this slide, this is a huge, complicated process, and it's best to take it step by step. But it may not be steps in a straight line. Be prepared to skip around a bit as many processes overlap. I'm hopeful that as you revisit this graphic, that you can see all the components we talked about today in this video. I also want to remind you that this presentation provided an overview of these 17 videos. Don't hesitate to review them in that they provide a more in-depth explanation of what the concepts described today. Links can be found on the MDE and MinShape websites. Thank you for taking the time to review the standard implementation process. I am so hopeful that these videos are helpful as you finalize your preparation to fully implement the Minnesota Physical Education Standards during the 2023 to 24 school year. I can't thank you enough for your dedication to Minnesota students and our goal as physical educators to encourage happy and physically active students that grow into happy and physically active adults. My best to you all.